Emmanuel Macron pleads for calm after a month of protests. So what can he do to stop these riots? I'm Imran Garda, and today's newsmaker is France's Yellow Vests. Emmanuel Macron may have become France's youngest president ever, but he did so under the suspicion that he'd be a leader for the rich and not one for France's famously outspoken working class. For activists, a proposed hike in fuel taxes cemented their fears. And what started on November 17th is being summed up into 4 acts. Act 1, hundreds of thousands of people block roads across France. Act 2, the protests turn violent. Act 3, demonstrators call for Macron to quit. And Act 4, civil unrest mars the Festival of Lights in both Lyon and Saint-Étienne. In response, Macron cancelled the fuel tax hikes, promised to raise wages, and in an almost unprecedented step, went on TV to apologize for adding to the public's anger. But are those concessions enough? Because before Macron could speak, protest leaders already called for a 5th act. With more, here's Haider Abbasi.
What began as peaceful protests has turned into a rage against the state. Mass rallies and riots have erupted in cities across France. Nearly 140,000 people took to the streets on Saturday, 10,000 alone in Paris. They call themselves the Yellow Vests. The demonstrators say they've been ignored by the elite, but with their fluorescent vests, they've become visible. The protest began last month, with people marching against an increase in fuel tax. But they've been expanded into other grievances, such as low wages, high living costs, and small pensions. Now many are urging the French president to resign.
What we want is a change of government. That's something we can agree on. Most people, everyone wants that. We don't want them anymore. They're no longer credible. It's impossible.
Emmanuel Macron is accused of being out of touch and of not listening to the complaints of ordinary people. The government caved into the initial demand of the protesters, dropping the planned fuel hike last week. But the Yellow Vests aren't satisfied. They say more must be done to address what they say is rising inequality in France. The rallies have been held for 4 weekends in a row, and the vandalism is hurting business.
I
think it's very bad news for the French economy, very bad news for business owners, and for all those who counted on their year-end sales to bring in higher revenues.
The loss for businesses across France is estimated to be $1.5 billion. The French president kept quiet during the protests. He says he didn't want to aggravate the demonstrators. But that hasn't worked, and calls for him to resign have grown louder. Macron's approval ratings have dropped to 23% from 34% in August. Now, after weeks of unrest, he's finally spoken.
Nous voulons une France où l'on peut vivre dignement de son travail. Sur ce point, nous sommes allés trop lentement. Je veux intervenir vite et concrètement sur ce sujet.
Macron says the minimum wage will be increased by more than $100 a month. Employers will be encouraged to pay an end-of-year bonus, and a planned tax for pensioners will be cancelled. The president condemned the violence, but said the anger of protesters was, in many ways, legitimate. But Macron says he won't reintroduce a tax on the rich. So will these concessions be enough to appease the Yellow Vests? And does this show that violent protests are effective? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Let's go to our panel now. Jen Schwadi joins me from the French city of Toulouse. She's an assistant professor at the Observatoire Sociologique de Changement. In our London studio, Joseph Downing, who's a fellow at the London School of Economics, who focuses on nationalism. And from Paris is TRT World's editor-at-large, Craig Kapidas. I thank you all for joining us. Jen, let me begin with you. Macron says this is a legitimate anger. He says, I know I've hurt some of you. And he suspended the tax increase on fuel, increased the minimum wage, and so on. Is that going to be enough for those people on the streets?
That's the million-dollar question, right? So if I could tell you what was going to happen next, I'd be a millionaire and would know what is going to happen with the stock market, right? But I think what we do know is that Macron has responded to a very strong protest movement. What could happen is, and what I see watching online and being in the streets and talking to people, is that Macron's reaction to the protest movement is only inspiring more people to participate. They see what collective action can do. And their struggles economically have not yet gone away. So until these promises that have been made actually hit their pocketbooks, I predict that we're going to see this movement only grow in the long run.
Craig Capitas, let me bring you in here. Let me give you a little story. During the time of the French election, we discussed this a little bit, both on and off the camera. And perhaps when Macron had won and there was the election of a centrist, there were people in Brussels and elsewhere that breathed a sigh of relief, perhaps, elites all over the continent that had to breathe a sigh of relief. But did it, in a way, just put a lid on the fact that there were many who felt that their voice was best expressed by the far right, with the National Front and the Le Pens and so forth, or the far left with the likes of Mélenchon? Did France sort of forget that undercurrent was still happening, and are we seeing the fruits of that happening right now?
What France forgot that it needed organized political parties. There is no longer a center-left or a center-right here in France. For some, nothing Macron can do or say will be enough. Whether his change of tone, contrition, the fiscal relief he's giving will help restore his authority depends entirely on public opinion and on street theater, because it's not going to come from the National Assembly where he holds a supermajority. Just earlier today, there were hundreds and hundreds of students on the streets of Paris saying, "Hey, Manu, what have you done for us?" Nothing.
Joseph Downing, the simplest of questions needs to be asked, because there's a lot of noise out there, especially if you follow this story on social media. Who the hell are these people? Who's leading them? What do they want?
Oh, well, this is a very interesting question, because there is no single they as a people. The Yellow Vest movement has attracted, it started off, I think, with this sort of upper working, lower middle classes that felt their standard of living was being squeezed. It has sucked in, especially in the violence we've seen on the streets of Paris, those from the far right and those from the far left as well. So there is no one central concern. There is no one central leadership. And this, I think, is where it's easy to overstate the significance of this movement and overstate its longevity. I actually don't foresee a situation where this is going to be important as a movement in France ongoing, because we've already seen the support for the Yellow Vest movement nationally drop from around the high 80s, so it was quoted at 88% 2 weeks ago, down to around 66% over the weekend. So we're already seeing the appeal of this movement tail off, and we're actually going to see, with the reforms that Macron's promised in hiring the minimum wage, he will actually alienate many people from pushing for more concessions, because they see France as overly regulated, as lazy, people as overly paid. They actually want someone who's going to bring in free market reforms. This is where France is an extremely complex political landscape that defies sort of simplistic explanations, I think.
Right. So, Jen, we had Joseph mention the polls. More than 80% of the people in the country supported the protest. Now it's down to the 60s, still pretty high. Let me look at some other polls in terms of who they were protesting against, Macron and the ruling elite. Only 16% of the French think that political leaders take their opinions into account. That's an IEP survey. And 83% believe politicians ignore them. What does that tell us about France, Jen, and what does that tell us about what's playing out on the streets?
Right. So as someone who does research on social movements, as a movement like this, as a popular movement is unfolding, it's really a moving target to keep track of what's going on. And I think some of the poll numbers that were mentioned in some ways reflect people saying, I don't support the specific violence. But overall, if you talk to people, especially outside Paris, there's a very anti-Paris, anti-institutional, anti-Macron, anti-elite sentiment that is not going to disappear overnight. And it's true, we don't know what kind of shape this movement is going to take. But no matter what, when a popular movement arises such as this, and they've happened historically before the internet, before Facebook, that if an organization on the ground that organically comes up from the movement itself, if that doesn't really develop in this case, other organizations are going to come in and fill that vacuum. And we've already seen that with both far left, far right leaders. We've seen bots and other fake news. But none of that is going to really take away from the sentiment and the anger that many in France have for the establishment.
Yeah, and people have said that this has played out in 4 acts so far. Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the leftist leader, says a 5th act is soon underway. Have a little listen to what he had to say.
I believe that the 5th act to be played out next Saturday, the 5th act of the beginning of the citizens' revolution that is happening in our country, will be a moment of great mobilization. But of course, like everyone, I know the decision will be made by those on the ground.
Craig Capitas, is Mélenchon just trying to smuggle himself into something that is giving him renewed political capital, or is this serious? Would Macron's words possibly be not enough for both the left and the right?
My take on covering this story is that people who are not here are really overestimating the power of the far left and the far right in France to form any meaningful group as a unit or even as a coalition. France is a republic. There are 577 seats in the French National Assembly, of which Macron controls over 300. There are at most 50 to 55 anti-Macronites in the National Assembly. Macron is not going anywhere, at least until 2022. There are provisions for what they call here destitution, which is impeachment. But Macron is nowhere near the bar for anyone to bring impeachment proceedings against him. So whether the French like it or not, whether Europe likes it or not, whether those who are supporting the Paris Climate Accords like it or not, Macron is in charge until 2022. There is no organized political opposition to him. He wiped out the center left and he wiped out the Socialist Party here, to the point that the Socialist Party had to sell off some of its real estate. This is Emmanuel Macron's show.
So, Joseph Downing, is that the reason why we're seeing a medley of messages and we can't quite figure out who's out on the streets? Because it's a bunch of people. You can't quite reduce the protester to one particular psychographic or demographic.
100% I agree with that. I think, and this is the thing with a spontaneous social movement, is because there is no leader, because there is no set manifesto, because there are no conditions, if you will, upon which you have to fulfill to join, everyone can invest whatever they think that is their grievance in the Yellow Vest movement, which to me sums up one of the sort of intractable dilemmas of French politics, which is when you do polls, when you ask people, people want reform. But reform is a word like justice or democracy. Of course, we all want it. But what does it mean? And when you begin to then tap down and say to people, OK, so what do you really want? The diversity of voices is not only staggering, but it becomes clear that people don't want reform of their own privileges. And to me, the real lack that Macron, in his credibility as a reformer, has been his inability to attack the parasitic French state, which hoovers up a huge amount of French GDP, which spends, euros as if they're going out of fashion. And to me, if Macron was to make, serious concessions, it would be the reform of the state, the reform of ministerial privileges. But like everyone else in France, he wants reform to other constituencies, not his own.
Jen Shraddy, is that fair? Oh, okay. Wait, bring in Craig. Come in, and then Jen. Is that fair, Craig? That Macron doesn't want to reform the parasitic French state?
No, what the people on the street want is very simple. Show me the money. And Macron doesn't have any. He's got a $2.7 trillion and growing national debt. He's paying $62 billion a year interest on the principal. He's not even paying off the debt. He doesn't have the money. All of those numbers are increasing. And one of the demands of the protesters, as amorphous as they might be, and this is critical here, they're demanding debt forgiveness, which is something you do in an African third world country. You don't do that in a Western democracy that's operating under the normalcies of capitalism. But this is one of their major demands. The other factor here, briefly, Imran, is the people in France believe that when they pay their taxes, that money is going to pay for services for them and their fellow citizens. The majority of that money goes to service the interest on the principal. It doesn't go back into the country. When they need more money, they go out and make another bond offer, or they go to the market for a loan. So what Macron has here is an arithmetic problem. He doesn't have the money the people are asking for.
Jen, is that true? Is it all about the money?
The money is definitely a key part, but the other key thing to remember is that people are up in arms that the wealthy have been given tax cuts, right? And so I think if we say they don't have the money, it depends on who's being taxed and who's not. And I think if we look at, other social movements, for example, the Tea Party movement in the United States, which was also on the surface anti-tax. T stands for taxed enough already. But the Tea Party movement, which was a very conservative movement, was against government intervention. That's not what's happening here with the Gilets jaunes. They're wanting the government to do something. They're anti-Macron, they're anti-elite, but they are, very happy that, overall, some people want more, but very pleased with Macron's announcement yesterday for 100 more euros per month in the minimum wage. They're wanting more of that. And that's what we'll see in terms of the types of demands that continue to be made.
Joseph Downing.
Look, Jen's making an excellent point here, because all of the humble pie that Macron ate last night in his 13 minutes of pre-recorded video, the most important slice he served up was when he said that they had to keep the wealth tax off the books, because if they went back to the wealth tax, Macron said, more and more people would leave France. They would not only see capital flight, they would also see intellectual flight. So what this comes down to is growth. There is no growth in France. Conventional economic wisdom says those with money institute growth. Again, as Jen pointed out, and our other guest pointed out, the French imperial system is not geared towards a growth economy vis-a-vis the new global economy. The only place you will see any growth in France are in big corporations, most of which have substantial shareholding by the state. If you want to make money in France, the best place to go is the United States, not here if you're just starting out, if you're a millennial. That's why Macron cannot reinstitute the wealth tax.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, looking at it in terms of foundational issues with the whole way France runs its economy. Joseph Downing, back to the people on the streets, and I'll let this be the final word. It's been a restless time on the continent over the past few years. Europe is certainly not boring anymore for outsiders. How would you compare the nationalism and the populism on display on the streets of Paris to other movements on the continent that we've seen over the past couple years?
To me, it seems as if what all of these movements share is they share in a sort of anger and a discontent with a system really of growing inequality in Europe. We've seen the erosion of the middle classes and the privileges of the working classes in the UK since Thatcherism. But this is something that's occurring across all major European economies, which is presenting the political establishment with a real problem. And we can see in France what we also see in the UK and what we also see perhaps beginning to play out in the US, which is a breakdown of the established rules of politics. People didn't really see this in some ways when Macron got to power because he's a centrist. But the fact that someone from outside, even though he's not really that outside, but he's outside enough, given how closed the French political system was prior to Macron, for someone like him to be able to take the presidency is remarkable. And this is what we're seeing across the continent really is the breakdown of the established rules of politics. We see it here in the UK, and we're beginning to see it in France. What I'm worried about in the French case is, if Macron is unpopular, who emerges to fill the vacuum in 2022? Not the centre-left, not the centre-right, I would argue not the far-right even, because Marine Le Pen seems to have, and the National Front have imploded since the election. But who will rise to fill this vacuum? That, for me, is the sort of worrying next question.
Okay, gentlemen and the lady, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed having that discussion. Jen Strati, Joseph Downing, and Craig Capitas, thanks for joining us on the Newsmakers. Coming up on the Newsmakers, did Iran test a new ballistic missile for self-defense or to provoke the United States? And will the new face of Germany's ruling party help keep Chancellor Angela Merkel in power, or will she be shown the door before her fourth term is up? A senior commander with the Revolutionary Guard has now confirmed that Iran has carried out a new ballistic missile test. The White House has condemned the test and called on Europe to follow its lead and hit Tehran with new sanctions. But is the United States also to blame? After all, President Donald Trump ripped up the Iran nuclear deal, an accord that discouraged the testing of ballistic missiles. So, is the White House's policy against Tehran backfiring? That debate in a moment. But first, here's Shoaib Hassan.
It's an escalation in a game of brinksmanship between the United States and Iran that many say is threatening peace in the Middle East. The two sides have exchanged threats and accusations after US President Donald Trump pulled out of a widely heralded nuclear peace deal in May this year. The latest sticking point is the ballistic missile test carried out by Iran on December the 1st, followed by the US asking the UN Security Council to condemn the launch. Iran has a highly developed ballistic missile program. Most of the missiles have been built in Iran, but some have been purchased from Russia and North Korea. The weapon systems include the short-range Fateh that can hit a target up to 200 kilometers away, and long-range ones like the Shahab-3, which can reach 2,500 kilometers. Iran says they are kept as a counterweight against arch-enemy Israel. The missiles can hit all of the Middle East, and US bases in Afghanistan are also within their range. The latest version could boost the range to up to as much as 3,000 kilometers, which would put parts of Europe within reach. The US insists that the Iranian program is a threat to world peace and has called for firmer action.
We would like to see the European Union pass sanctions that would designate the people and the organizations that are facilitating Iran's missile testing and missile proliferation, both activities of which are in defiance of the UN Security Council.
European leaders have criticized the latest Iranian tests, but they've refused to join the US as it presses ahead with an oil and trade embargo on Iran. It's a move that's enraged the leadership in Tehran.
تحریم‌های اقتصادی ظالمانه و غیرقانونی آمریکا علیه ملت شریف ایران به عنوان شکل بارزی از تروریسم ملت ما را هدف قرار داده. تروریسم اقتصادی به معنای وحشت آفرینی در موضوع اقتصاد یک کشور و ایجاد رعب و ترس در دیگر کشورها جهت ممانعت از تجارت و سرمایه گذاری در کشور هدف است.
Iranian leaders have also vowed that if Iran's oil is blocked, they would not allow any oil to move through the Strait of Hormuz. More than 30% of the world's oil supply is transported through that sea-based corridor. So, is Iran's latest missile test a show of defiance against the sanctions? And does this mean that the US trade embargo is not having Washington's desired effect and has instead only heightened tensions in the Middle East? Shoaib Hassan, the newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, we're joined in Washington by law professor Dave Jonas, who Trump unsuccessfully nominated to be general counsel for the U.S. Department of Energy. Also in Washington, D.C. is Adam Weinstein, a policy associate at the National Iranian Council. And in New York is Amir Hanjani. He's a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council South Asia Center. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Adam Weinstein, if I can begin with you. So Iran basically test firing new ballistic missiles. Is this a vindication that the United States was right to leave the Iran nuclear deal, or JCPOA? Or is it a negative symptom of the United States leaving the Iran deal? Which one is it?
I think it's a bit of both. Certainly, I believe it was a mistake to leave the JCPOA. It is true that Iran has always engaged in provocative behavior, but leaving the JCPOA unilaterally really weakened our leverage over Iran and ultimately weakened the U.S. sanctions regime. A good analogy would be when someone takes only some of their antibiotic and their immune system strengthens. And what has happened is that Iran has been pushed further east. Its relationships with China and Russia are improving, even its relationship with India. The U.S. isn't able to enact sanctions in the same hard-hitting way that it was able to do during the Obama administration. Evidence of that is that they granted a waiver for the Chabahar port project in Iran to India. And a big reason for that is the development of that project is crucial to security in Afghanistan. So what we see here is that the U.S. has left the JCPOA, emboldened Iran as a result, and undermined its own European allies.
Okay, Dave Jonas, leaving the Iran nuclear deal, imposing new sanctions, it's good for nobody, just makes things worse. Why do you disagree?
I disagree because it was, in my mind, the right thing to do. The deal was bad from the start. President Trump campaigned on the fact that it was a bad deal from the start, as he often said, the worst deal ever. And it's hard for me to argue with that. From a legal perspective, there's no question that it was an inappropriate deal. I recently completed a work on looking at all the American arms control treaties for years in the past, and virtually 98% of them were done as legally binding treaties. And this one, of course, was not even an executive agreement. It was a politically binding commitment. In other words, very little more than a handshake or a policy agreement. And so when one president makes such a weak agreement, which does essentially an end run around the U.S. Senate and its constitutional prerogatives, then they have no right to be upset when the next president, who campaigned on saying it was the worst deal ever, negates that deal. And he was I believe, utterly right to do so.
Amir Hanjani, when there are those who see the Iranians playing chicken with new missiles, they look at Iranian actions in Syria in supporting Bashar al-Assad, Iranian actions in Iraq, Iranian actions in Lebanon, supporting the Houthis in Yemen, and they say, come on, Obama must have been the stupidest leader ever to make a deal with these guys. Do they have a point?
Well, Iran was doing all those things before the nuclear deal, and they're doing all these things ever since the U.S. has pulled out of the nuclear deal. The nuclear deal was just to take one issue and to essentially push it down the road 10 to 15 years, take it off the table, and give breathing room and space for diplomacy to engage in a whole host of other issues that trouble U.S. policymakers and the U.S. partners in the region. By unilaterally leaving the nuclear deal, just because President Trump said it's the worst deal ever, doesn't mean it was the worst deal ever. President Trump says a lot of things that turn out not to be true. I think by last count it was 6,000, or by the Washington Post, or 5,000, whatever. The IAEA, the global arms control community, has called it the gold standard of non-proliferation regime. Now, could it be strengthened? Absolutely. Are there loose ends to it? For sure. But the best way to address it is to stay in the deal where the U.S. has the most leverage. The U.S. has leverage when they're in the deal, pounding their fist at the table, working in concert with allies, with partners and allies, including the P5+1.
Okay.
Not by exiting and having Iran just get closer and closer to China, India, and Russia.
Okay, so Dave Jonas, so far there hasn't been any indication from the IAEA that Iran has resumed uranium enrichment or has got closer to the bomb, right? Tell me why you think France, the UK, Germany, Russia, and China are still sticking to their guns and still abiding by the deal and doing business with the Iranians. What don't they get that you get?
Certainly. Let me just correct one thing my colleague said. I don't believe the term gold standard has ever been applied to the deal itself. The gold standard term came from President Obama when he noted that the gold standard of nuclear agreements, which the United States usually uses in what are called 123 agreements for peaceful cooperation with other nations, is that we will not allow our fellow nations who we're making these deals with to enrich or reprocess. In other words, we won't allow them the path to a nuclear weapon. And by the way, Iran was offered that deal. They were offered access to a fuel bank, and as if they certainly don't need nuclear power as it is. They're sitting on a sea of oil. Nuclear power is very expensive compared to oil, and therefore that's one reason this is a horrible deal. The second reason is that the inspection regime, President Obama crossed two of his red lines, one of which was anytime, anywhere inspections. Instead, we have something like 24-day inspections. If you could imagine talking to a mobster and telling them, hey, we're going to come search your place in 24 days, don't change anything, don't move anything, you can see how ridiculous that is. And then even U.S. inspectors are not allowed in to inspect because of a ridiculous provision in the agreement that says that if there are no diplomatic relations with Iran, then those inspectors, even if they're attached to the International Atomic Energy Agency, if they're American, cannot inspect. If that's not a ridiculously bad deal, I don't know what is.
Let me go to Adam Weinstein and ask if Iran decides to leave the deal, what happens? Because we've got indications not just from the Supreme Leader, but even from President Rouhani, from the Foreign Minister Zarif, that the sanctions are making them fed up. They're getting annoyed at the fact that they see the Americans as provoking them constantly. So if they leave the deal with the other members of the JCPOA, what's that going to do, Adam?
Well, let me before I answer that, let me address one point that the law professor made, which I agree with. It would be great if legally binding agreements could be made, and unfortunately, we live in an era where executive power is such that a president can get the United States engaged in a protracted conflict that is almost impossible to leave, but it's extremely difficult to accomplish other foreign policy initiatives, especially diplomatic ones. And that's a testament to the bipartisan nature of our times, and that's been going on for at least a decade. To address your point, I don't think Iran will leave the JCPOA anytime soon, despite its tough talk. It wouldn't be in Iran's interest. Iran's not getting the full economic benefit that it was promised, but it's still getting economic benefits from Russia, India, China, and to a lesser extent, Europe. All leaving the JCPOA has done is weaken the United States sanctions regime, weaken the ability to inflict sanctions on other nations in the future, alienated our European allies, given Iran more leverage than ever before, and advanced China and Russia's pivot into the Middle East.
Amir Hanjani, is that true? Does Iran actually have more leverage than it has ever had before?
I don't know if it has more leverage, but I agree with my colleague Adam that it's weakened. Look, the United States is still the global superpower and is able to exert a lot of pressure. And it certainly has and will be doing so, as we see with Iran today. However, we're going into we're moving from a unipolar world to a world of great power competition. And in this world of great power competition, Russia and China, India, other players are going to come in and fill the vacuum that the United States has, over time, been withdrawing from. We see Russian involvement in the Middle East. We see China getting involved in the Horn of Africa with a base there. Both Russia and China view Iran as a security partner. They view its economy as essential to an export market. They view it as a stabilizing force, quite the opposite of the United States in the Middle East. And this great era of great power competition allows for Iran to essentially play spoiler. And that's what it's doing. However, it's doing so on the U.S.'s dime because You also have an issue right now between the U.S. and its European allies and partners. They are, I wouldn't say siding with Iran, but at least staying in the deal and trying to make the deal work in spite of the United States. We've never really seen that before.
Dave Jonas, from the Iranian perspective, they saw the United States invade Iraq, invade Afghanistan, have bases in a handful of countries surrounding it, encircling it, more than a dozen bases. It would be the equivalent of the Iranians having bases in Canada and Mexico and all along the US coast. Why shouldn't the Iranians try to protect and defend themselves from American power?
That's a fair point. I mean, they're certainly not viewed as an ally of America. They're viewed as I certainly view them as an enemy state. But I think that the issue that President Trump wanted to come across is not that he was withdrawing from the deal and walking away, but that he wanted to negotiate a better deal. And I think that can be done. In other words, some of the many problems with the deal are the deal fails to recognize that Iran already has a legally binding commitment to not to pursue nuclear weapons, and that's through its obligations in the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty that has been in existence since 1970. And yet in this agreement, Iran makes that promise, the most important promise, not to make nuclear weapons, in the least binding part of the agreement. In other words, the agreement is not legally binding itself, but preambles to agreements are not binding at all, even in legally binding agreements. They're merely aspirational, whereas any binding commitments come across in the operative paragraphs of a treaty or an agreement or a political agreement, which is what this is. Now, America observes its political agreements as if they were legally binding, but a state like Iran, which has continually ignored its legally binding commitments, both through UN Security Council Resolution 1929, which instructed it not to enrich uranium, and in its safeguards agreement with the IAEA, in which it was supposed to report any nuclear activity that it had going on for 20 years, which it failed to do. It's hard to see how Iran, in ignoring legally binding obligations, would scrupulously observe a non-legally binding obligation such as this deal. And that's why it could be made stronger and better. And I think that's what President Trump wants to do with this deal.
Amir, do you trust that President Trump wants a better deal?
Only President Trump can answer that, but just to get to answer a question my colleague has raised. No, the U.S. has, under President Trump, exited from a whole host of political binding agreements and arms control agreements. We're just about to exit the INF treaty. In fact, even if you had a treaty that was legally binding and passed by the Senate, the next president can simply exit that treaty by notifying the Senate that it's no longer in the U.S. interest to abide by that treaty. There have been a whole host of treaties that President Trump, political, not even call them legal binding, let's go political. You can start with the Paris Climate Accords, the Post Office agreement, which is bizarre. I mean, he is essentially taking a hammer to the global security architecture by exiting from deals that, for the last 70 years, that have made the United States safer and more robust.
Gentlemen, I've got to wrap, but it's been good to talk to all of you. Amir Hanjani, Adam Weinstein, and Dave Jonas, thanks so much for joining us on the Newsmakers.
Yes, we did have a competition. And yes, yesterday we had a decision, a clear decision. But no, this party is not divided. Altogether, we have the task to work on the unity of this party.
Germany's ruling party suffered its worst results in decades during recent local elections. It cost Angela Merkel her position as the head of the party, but she's now likely to serve out her fourth term as Chancellor after her Christian Democrats narrowly elected a new leader with the moniker of Mini Merkel. Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer is a moderate former state premier who is Merkel's chosen successor, but with voters upset over the government's perceived shift to the center, will Germany swing further to the right? Well, let's go to Berlin. Frank Hansel is a German MP with the right-wing AfD party, and Matthew Karnischnig is Politico's chief Europe correspondent. Thanks so much for joining us, gentlemen. Matthew, let me start with you. Before we talk about what this means for the country and the political trends, what does AKK taking over from Merkel mean for the ruling coalition and the CDU?
Well, I think in the immediate term for the ruling coalition, it means that they can continue on as they have done. It should quiet down some of the noise that we've heard in the CDU recently, especially after those elections that you mentioned. But otherwise, it should allow this coalition to continue along with its agenda, at least until the European elections, which is the next big test, and they're coming up in May. So I think that you'll see some stability for the coming months, and then we'll see what happens at that European election, and that could throw everything into doubt again.
Frank Hansel, one of the primary focuses of what you guys do is that you were anti-Merkel. Merkel must go was your slogan. So now do you have a bit of a conundrum because Merkel's essentially gone? What are you going to do now?
Well, it's really a good political sign that the era of Mrs. Merkel is over. We have to see what her successor is doing, but I coincide completely with what you said before, that there is a range within the next half year where there's still certain stability within German politics, but we have to see that it's not only the European election which we have in May, but also 3 elections in 3 German states, like especially Saxony and in Thuringia, where we are in front, where AfD is in front of CDU. And this together with the failure of the Christian Democrats in the European election will make another step for probably new elections or a completely redesign of German policy.
For many people across the continent, Frank, the fact that people who used to vote for parties within Merkel's coalition turned right towards you is a travesty. It's scary. It brings back echoes of the past with xenophobia, anti-immigration, racism, right? Do you take the credit for them losing power?
Well, first of all, I always say, and restate it again here, we are not anti-migration. We do know for demographic reason in the whole of Europe that we need migration, but it's got to be organized and it's got to be legal. First, we are not against refugees. We know there are problems in the world and we have to take some of them, but it must be on a legal basis. That's the first to say. The other thing is that the elites, the former elites, are really have come to an end. And you see this in Spain, where a new party also is rising. And you see it with the decline of the Social Democrats. We are in a turning point, and it doesn't make sense always to claim that the new parties are all extremists or right-wing. We are just filling a representation lack of the former elites. That's all.
Matthew, there was a more conservative candidate, Friedrich Merz. Tell me what it means that Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, AKK, was actually the chosen successor, and she made it as the head of the party rather than him. What does that tell us?
Well, it tells us that the CDU, despite all of the problems that it's had recently, really wants to continue with the status quo, more or less. They don't want to take any big risks, and I think that Merz would have been a riskier strategy for the party because he would have moved the party to the right. He vowed to try and cut in half the support for the AfD by taking a more conservative position on migration, on some fiscal issues, for example, taxes and that type of thing, which would be very controversial. And he might have succeeded in winning back some people from the right who have left the CDU recently. But the risk was that he would lose some of the coalition that Merkel has put together in recent years by bringing on voters from the Greens and from the SPD, people who might be a little bit more liberal in their views. And I think this was sort of the choice ultimately that the party delegates had to make on Friday was, are they better off continuing the course now with a new leader, a new face, not Merkel, but some policies close to what Merkel represents and trying to maintain this coalition? Or are they going to try and really sharpen their conservative profile to go back to kind of the old CDU, which was a bit more conservative. And so I think this tells us that they've really tried to play it safe here for now, but we'll see if this works. I mean, you know, as we heard, in the coming months, you've got a number of elections. You've got these elections in Eastern Germany too, which are very important, where the AfD stands a chance to actually win a couple of these states, which for the establishment parties would be an absolute disaster. So I think we really have to keep a close eye on AKK and whether she can bring this party together now, because it's still very divided.
Yes. So, Frank, given that they decided to go with the status quo and they played it safe, as Matthew says, is that more of an opportunity for you? Because they're easier to attack from the right, aren't they?
Yes, but the analysis of Matthew is exactly what we think, what's true. I think, on the other hand, that Mr. Merz probably was merely a projection of the voters to more conservatism. We have to see that the CDU in the last 15 years has completely changed. The membership has changed, so it would have been very doubtful, and that's where he is correct. It was a risk to have voted for him as president of the CDU, because he would have to prove that he really can transform the CDU again to a conservative or new conservative party. Since this is not going to happen anymore, this is, of course, what we always state, the representation lack of the center-right. It's not be fulfilled by Mrs. Kramp-Karrenbauer, probably. It's, at least the electorate of Germany will think that it's Merkel II, Merkel II. And this really makes it a lot easier for us. And we are very looking forward to what's going to happen in the next months and the following year.
And Matthew, as Chancellor, is all of this going to take the pressure off Merkel ahead of the next federal elections in October 2021? Is that question mark over her future put aside?
Yes, I think so, because we have to see that the Social Democrats have put in the contract, in the political contract of their coalition, that in the half term they want to rethink the whole achievement till then. And it's very probable that the Social Democrats might leave the coalition and we go into new elections. And this is then definitely the end of Merkel.
Okay,
that's
interesting. So, okay, so that's what Frank says. So he says we might go to new elections. What do you think, Matthew? Because others see the fact that Merkel has chosen a continuity candidate for the next couple of years. It means that perhaps she's safe as Chancellor until the federal elections.
Well, I think what people are going to start asking now is how long will Merkel remain Chancellor until she decides to transition to Kramp-Karrenbauer, possibly stepping aside before the next election to give Kramp-Karrenbauer the opportunity to show that she can run the government for a time at least before the new election. And so those doubts haven't really disappeared. There are also all of these pressures on the Social Democrats, and they might decide at some point it's not in our interest to remain in this coalition, as Frank just said. So, you know, there are still a lot of question marks hanging over Merkel's chancellorship, but at least for now, I think that she's resolved the immediate issues, the immediate pressures that she was facing. And I think that she's going to continue to try and leave her mark on the international stage, as we've seen over the past several days, with her going to Marrakesh, for example, and accentuating again all of the European issues and that type of thing. So I think we're going to see Merkel focusing more on international issues and leaving some of the domestic issues to Kramp-Karrenbauer and to others in her government.
Frank, is the German political future for the likes of you, the AfD, and for the Greens on the other end of this political spectrum, and is everybody else in the middle perhaps on fragile ground?
I think so. I think the new red is green and the new black is blue. We are actually the two contrahands in the future policy. We see, for instance, that the Greens want to destroy the German car industry. They are putting the climate change onto the front top agenda. Nobody can pay this whole energy change they are doing with their policies. I think people will realize that the hype the Greens actually have due to the lack of convincement of the Social Democrats, they will fall into a deep hole, and I think then it's open for us, for the AfD. But I state that we also, in our own party, we have to do some homework. We have to convince the electorate that we are a center-right party, that we stand for the future for Germany, that we stand for the future of a free Europe, of free nations, and that all those elements that the leading parties for the moment saying that we are this or we are that, we are anti-that, we're anti-that, it's not true. That we can convince from the bottom of our hearts the people that we are the new political party that they can trust.
But Frank, your leaders have not made it easy for yourselves, right? With comments about Holocaust remembrance and the Nazis in the past, and you have had members you've had to kick out.
That's what I'm saying.
Who are neo-Nazis, right?
That's
so
what
it's not as if you've made it easy for yourselves.
First, they're not neo-Nazis. They are said to be from the current elite. But we have certain problems, and that's what I'm saying. And I state this as a self-criticism. We have to do our homeworks in order to convince the electorate that we are a political party you can trust in. We have nothing to do with the German past. We want a good, safe, and constructive German future. And that's all. We want to make Germany fit for the future, holding our industry structure, holding our welfare state, which will collapse if we have illegal mass migration. Right. These are our points, and they are nothing to debate on this. We are a good party and good for Germany.
Well, around 15% of the German voting population agrees with you, and that's what makes it fascinating for those of us from the outside looking in. Fascinating political times in Germany. Gentlemen, Matthew Karnichnik and Frank Hansel. I've got to move on, but I thank you very much for joining us. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Imran Garda. You can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook and Twitter. Remember to like, follow and subscribe. Next time, Theresa May delays the vote on her Brexit deal to renegotiate with Europe. Will Brussels play ball? Until then, thank you for watching. Bye-bye.